Okay. We started a little late, so we're going to get pretty straight into our program. Dr. Sikivu Hutchinson is an author. She's a member of the LA County Human Relations Commission. Her books are Moral Combat, Black Atheist Gender Politics, and the Values War. Very, very important topic. Very important topic. And this is of special interest to me. It's kind of specialized. Imagining transit, race, gender, and transportation policies in Los Angeles. I first heard Dr. Hutchinson speak at the Secular Student Alliance Regional Conference, Leadership Conference, out in, not Santa Clarita, well, out at Cal State Lutheran. And she's really a marvelous speaker. She has a lot to tell us, and without further ado, I'm going to ask her to come up and give us her presentation, Beyond Kumbaya.
Okay, good morning. Actually, this talk is going to be an extension of some remarks that I made during the Texas Free Thought Convention, which some of you may have attended a couple weeks ago. Really great, compelling conference, and this is going to be grounded within the context of contemporary racial politics. Again, from an African American secular humanist perspective. In times of spiritual duress, as many of you may know, some Christians look heavenward and ask, what would Jesus do? But as a heathen, I feel that I have creative license to adopt my own cosmology. And so in this period of, I think we lost a little bit of our audio.
That's good.
It's too loud? Okay. In this era of white nationalist backlash, I sometimes find myself asking, what would Strom do? Some of you, may be familiar with Strom Thurmond. Those of you who are not Americans, Strom Thurmond was a South Carolina senator and one of the longest serving in American history. He was a segregationist Dixiecrat and a one-time presidential candidate for the states' rights Democratic Party platform in 1948. And so, musing about the impact that he thought that his candidacy would have had, he said that if I had been elected president in 1948, history would be vastly different. I believe we would have stemmed the growth of big government, which had begun with the New Deal and culminated with the Great Society. So Thurmond was, in addition to being a Dixiecrat, he was a prominent member of the Christian fundamentalist cabal, the Family, and he had the dubious distinction of having conducted the longest filibuster in American history over his opposition to the 1957 Civil Rights Bill. And so shortly after his death, as some of you may know, it was revealed that he was the father of an African-American woman named Essie Mae Washington Williams, who was then in her 70s. And she is one of my in-laws, coincidentally. And at the time of her birth, her mother was a young African-American woman named Carrie Butler, who was 16 years old, and who was a maid in the Thurmond household. So Butler died at a very young age, in her late 30s. And there are no real official records of her voice, and no histories that really capture her story, nor particularly frame it within the context of the institutional sexual violence against African American women and racial apartheid. But I maintain that her buried history speaks to why free thought and humanism are potentially liberatory for women of color, as well as to why race and gender remain intimately connected to the articulation of public morality in the United States. And so, recently, some have summoned the specter of, and the example of, the late Arizona Senator Barry Goldwater as the spiritual and political forebear of this era of white nationalist backlash. But I maintain that Thurman is a more appropriate example precisely because of the schizoid racial lineage and the legacy of racial terrorism that he represents. And in fact, his ghost really infects the tenor of a nation that is constantly propagandizing that it has evolved into this post-racial, colorblind font of exceptionalist democracy, despite the fact that the U.S. is, in this era, even more segregated in many regards than during the Brown v. Board desegregation era of the 1950s. And so, like millions of Americans, Thurman never quite got the email or the telegram that we, quote unquote, are all Africans, and that's a favorite catchphrase that's been evoked within the atheist, secular humanist sphere. We are all Africans, and that race is an illusion with no biological or genetic basis. And there's an interesting scene in the documentary of the same name, Race, the Power of an Illusion, which is produced in 2002, where a young white female runner speculates about the so-called source of African American runners' superior athletic prowess, and surmises that it might be due to the fact that blacks have an extra bone that gives them an unnatural, and some might say supernatural, advantage in track and field events. And so this myth of the supernatural, superhuman black athlete who's somehow blessed with excellence in very specific, three very specific Americana sports: track and field, football, and of course basketball. This myth is the linchpin of a multi-million-dollar global commodity that, in my mind, was best exemplified at the height of the popularity of Michael Jordan, where you had scores of young white kids running around claiming that they wanted to be just like Mike. Many of you may remember that very popular ad campaign that was in heavy rotation during the 80s and 90s. And being like Mike didn't mean being dark-skinned. It didn't mean being racially profiled. It didn't mean being Jim Crow'd in urban schools. And it certainly didn't mean being more likely to receive a predatory or a subprime home loan based upon one's skin color rather than one's income or one's credit score. Being like Mike meant being hip, being cool, being successful, and more to the point, being filthy up by one's bootstraps, quote unquote, rich. The epitome of the so-called colorblind American dream. And so, in many regards, the black athlete has morphed into a kind of racial aphrodisiac for white middle America. A white middle America that always seems to be so viscerally seduced by the dyad of either the black ball player or the black soul singer, the Michael Jacksons and the Aretha Franklins and the James Browns. And so the natural grace and the soulful masculinity and the Dionysian athleticism of the black athlete is attractive in a way that the specter of real flesh and blood black people in white middle America's churches, neighborhoods, schools, and God forbid, families is not. But the documentary, Race, the Power of an Illusion, I highly recommend anyone who has not seen this to check it out. It's a 3-part series. Race, the Power of an Illusion assures us that at the end of the day, we are all family, and again, race is a mirage, and it does so in 3 really interesting ways. One, it looks at the experiences of a group of high school students who are learning how to unpack the nuances of their mitochondrial DNA. And they're discovering that their classmates who they thought were most like them racially are actually quite different from them genetically and vice versa. The documentary also looks at the legacy of race construction vis-a-vis white supremacy, colonialism, imperialism, and institutional racism. And perhaps one of the most powerful moments in the documentary, the world-renowned evolutionary biologist Joseph Graves totally kicks to the curb and debunks any rarefied notions of colorblind meritocracy when he talks about the reality of being an esteemed black male researcher, scientist, and academician who is still on the campus of the elite university that he teaches at, mistaken in some instances for a criminal or an athlete. And so therein lies the rub for the white-dominated secular movement that is so assiduously, in my mind, avoided critical engagement with the implications of racial apartheid in the United States, vis-a-vis the social construction of citizenship, of democracy, of individual liberty, of all our vaunted Enlightenment principles, has avoided engagement with the whys and wherefores of African American and Latino overinvestment in hyper-religiosity, and the fact that it is informed by a white supremacist context, by the deep and intractable nature of segregation in the United States. And so, for example, black death row inmates like Troy Davis, recently lynched / executed by the state of Georgia. Many of you may be familiar with the case of Troy Davis, a most likely innocent man who was executed by Georgia, the state of Georgia, several weeks ago. Black death row inmates are disproportionately looking to Jesus for salvation and to the black faith community for political reinforcement, visibility, and support. Because the reality is that while the South may be the most bloodthirsty in terms of executions, and it may be the most law and order and trigger happy, it is not, at the end of the day, the most segregated. That distinction goes to the more secular, more enlightened North. And those of you that are familiar with African American social history know that African Americans migrated in greater numbers to the so-called North during the Great Migration period, which was in the 1920s to the 1960s, and that LA, for example, and other northern industrial cities were considered to be fonts of salvation, redemption, opportunity, deliverance from the racial terrorism that African Americans experienced in the deep Jim Crow South. And so writing about L.A., for example, in 1913, W.E.B. Du Bois was one of the premier secular humanist visionary thinkers, opined that Southern California had all of these opportunities that were available for African Americans. And again, playing into this iconography of L.A. as this golden space of opportunity and promised land.
Good question. I don't know the answer.
Du Bois was not acquainted with the fact that there was a Klan chapter in Watts. During the teens and 20s, Watts was a predominantly white enclave with its own homegrown, good old boy Klan chapter. And so Du Bois is perhaps best known for his prediction that the problem of the 20th century would be the problem of the color line. But he was also an early adherent of the Soviet Union, traveled there widely, and was a big admirer of Soviet-style secularism. And he also predicted that religion would recede, would decline in importance with regard to American society in particular, would be someday consigned, as we all would wish, to the dust heap of fairy tales and nursery rhymes. But standing here in the 21st century, Du Bois's prediction about the color line is prescient, but his speculation about religion, in my view, seems wildly fantastical. Because even he could not have foreseen what we're experiencing now, which is this ironclad realignment of white nationalism and supernaturalist / evangelical activism. backlash, blowback. And so the most visionary African-American humanist thinkers were radically of their times and beyond their times. They always framed their perspective on free thought and humanism vis-a-vis this connection between American racial apartheid and global human rights. Many of them deconstructed the connection between the disenfranchising regime of capitalism and black overinvestment in organized religion. And many were prescient enough to foresee the paradox, so-called, of a Christian nation that has devolved into the world's largest penitentiary and the most prolific jailer and executioner of peoples of African descent. And so this past September 11th, many in the Muslim community commemorated the 10-year anniversary of the attacks as a kind of turning point for Islamophobic persecution and, Islamophobic criminalization and religious persecution. But the 10-year milestones for people of color were even more insidious. Because despite the GOP's grand narratives of post-racialism and exceptionalism, the U.S. is the greatest nation on the planet. For people of color, high school educated to college educated, working class to upper middle class, people of color have found that their hold on the American dream has become even more tenuous, if not non-existent. And this is due in no small part to the staggering wealth gaps that exist between blacks and whites and Latinos and whites, long before the emergence of recession in the United States, long before. Deep and intractable wealth gaps. And so this recent report by Brown University concludes, surprise, surprise, what many of us can see empirically here in Southern California, which is one of the most segregated regions in the United States, is that blacks and Latinos still live in predominantly black and Latino communities, and that whites still live in predominantly white communities. And the linchpin of this is the wealth gap, gaps in family household income, gaps in particularly home equity, which is the cornerstone of what little black and Latino wealth exists in the United States. And so the report also implies that there is greater socioeconomic mobility for white working class folk than for Latino and African American middle class folk, thus debunking one of the most widely held views within the right camp, within the populist camp. And again, because there are these deep and intractable wealth gaps. And so the myth of the melting pot that many Americans have been born and bred on is perhaps even more of a sham in this era than it was during the Ozzie and Harriet era. And of course the Leave It to Beaver era. And so this is a picture of the Leave It to Beaver Cleaver family. And I thought that this was interesting to include because a lot of my work is within South LA schools. And Barbara Billingsley, the matriarch of the Leave It to Beaver clan, went to Washington Prep High School, which is in South LA, Imperial Western. And during that period, 1930s, that was a predominantly white enclave. And after the dismantling of racially restricted covenants in the 1940s period into the 1950s, it gradually became more African American. And so it's Ozzie and Harriet and Leave It to Beaver that the Tea Party and its political enablers would like to return to. Because that is essentially shorthand for a period in which blacks and Latinos knew their place. And this is exemplified by the flurry of anti-undocumented immigrant legislation, anti-family and anti-choice legislation, and anti-public employee union sentiment and public policy that has predominated over the past 2 years. So, for example, as many of you know, in Arizona, in Georgia, and Alabama, draconian anti-undocumented immigrant legislation not only disenfranchises undocumented immigrants and their families, and particularly children, at the linchpin of the Alabama public policy, but also, by extension, all Latinos and non-whites. Nationwide, draconian anti-choice legislation that requires women to undergo waiting periods before they get abortions, or undergo sonograms before they get abortions. Anti-family legislation that severely reduces, if not eliminates, nutrition programs, child care for working class families, disproportionately disenfranchises white working class women and their families, and women of color and their families. And so nationwide, looking at the prison complex, disparities, continuing disparities between crack versus powder cocaine sentencing, has locked up generations of African Americans, such that in our state and in our county, we have this staggering disparity in the prison population. African Americans comprising between 9 to 11% of the LA County and the general state population, and comprising 40% of the prison population. And so in urban communities of color, for every park, for every community center, for every recreational center, for every school, there are scores and scores of storefront churches, mid-sized churches, and mega churches that exist to fill the gaps of the absence of a social welfare safety net. And so talking about this nexus of race, religion, and class, A. Philip Randolph, who was a visionary, an unparalleled visionary, secular humanist, free thought, activist, intellectual, and labor organizer, in addition to a publisher of a landmark journal called The Messenger. Randolph had this to say in 1919. This was a Thanksgiving speech that he published in his journal. He said, "We do not wish to thank God. With us, we give thanks to a different deity. Our deity is the toiling masses." And this is something that I think is really critical for secular humanists of conscience, of progressive and radical consciousness. In this era in which Christian fascists have really begun to double down, not only in terms of public morality, policing abortion, policing gay marriage, and things of that nature, but also in terms of making a connection between public morality and social welfare. All of dismantling all of the quote-unquote New Deal freedoms, liberties, and policies that Americans have enjoyed over the past several decades. And so it's important to keep in mind that this intersection of public morality and social welfare is part of the march to theocracy that has always been, in my mind, informed by the nexus of economic resentment and white nationalism and heterosexist patriarchy. And so this term, Christian nation, for example, that's been resonating over the past several years. The term Christian nation has a very specific racial provenance. So, for example, in 1706, Christian Mather, who was a Puritan orator, evangelist, speaking about the project of, quote-unquote, Christianizing the Negro, said that your servants will be the better servants if they are Christian servants. And it really wasn't until the institutionalization of racial slavery in the 17th century that the terms white, Christian, and free became synonymous. Prior to that, whites really identified through the class status as laborers, as landed gentry, or as free men. And this was important because it was a critical distinction between this emerging category of whiteness and the category of enslaved African others. And so I think this is an important context to keep in mind when we consider that mainstream media more or less wrote the obituary of Christian evangelical activism prior to the election of Barack Obama. So you had religious right golden boys like Ralph Reed, formerly of the Christian Coalition, James Dobson of Focus on the Family, Tony Perkins of the Family Research Council. They had all either been disgraced by scandal, a la Reed, or marginalized. And so people in our secular community got all happy and felt all included because Barack Obama, recognizing the egregiousness of his predecessor vis-a-vis faith-based initiatives and other policies, extended an olive branch to secular coalitions, invited them to sit down and rub shoulders with the faith community at White House confabs. But the tenor of that discourse shifted with the populist backlash over health care reform, and particularly with the 2010 midterm elections, when the language of racial otherness began to seep more explicitly and more terroristically into public discourse. And so Obama resumed his uber-Christian posture in response. And speaking recently at a Silicon Valley fundraiser, Ralph Reed, newly disinterred at the head of a new PAC, Christian activist PAC, said that Obama has reawakened the sleeping giant of the social conservative vote. And so as the nation wriggles in the grip of the Jesus industry, a wholesale moral panic has descended, one that in my mind has very specific antebellum or pre-Civil War roots. And communities of color have been at the epicenter of this moral panic. The white religious right has begun assiduously courting new friends, third world allies in the so-called ghettos, descending and trying to recruit for a very specific cultural and moral propaganda mission. So, for example, this past summer, Rick Perry descended on LA to talk to Latino audiences about aborted babies. And this was part of the launch of a supersized crisis pregnancy center slated for development in South LA and funded supposedly by Latin American anti-abortion groups. Billboards proclaiming that the most dangerous place for a black or Latino child is in the womb have begun proliferating in communities of color nationwide. And so as these wealth gaps expand, as unemployment skyrockets amongst black and brown communities, over 20% for some age groups, as foreclosure and homelessness proliferate, the message to black and Latino women is to sit down, shut up, you get knocked up, have these babies, further the advancement of the race. Because the religious right of all ethnicities, black, Latino, and white, has been very skillful in manipulating another kind of nationalist message. That is, that abortion is a racist conspiracy and a moral scourge perpetrated by white feminazis under the aegis of Planned Parenthood. And so this dovetails quite neatly with the GOP's nostalgia propaganda that demonizes taxation for the wealthy, demonizes regulation, demonizes real families, choice, reproductive justice, and women's bodies. And as all of you in this room know, demonizes science, education, public policy, and research that's actually steeped in real empirical science as opposed to quackery, and contributes to an atmosphere in which, for the GOP and the Christian fascists, an LBJ would be considered to be, a Reagan would be considered to be as liberal as an LBJ. And so speaking about the scourge of black integration, Strom Thurmond had this to say, that there's not enough troops in the Army to force the Southern people to break down segregation and admit the Negro race into our theaters, into our swimming pools, into our homes, and into our churches. And I've often wondered what Carrie Butler who died again at a very young age, thought about this savage paradox. In her memoir, Miss Williams writes that Thurman helped fund part of her college education, and that she perceived that they had something of a father-daughter relationship, albeit within the carefully orchestrated confines of the state houses that he had tenure in for most of his life as governor of South Carolina and then as a U.S. senator. And American history essentially relies on the erasure of the instrumentality of sexual violence to the maintenance of empire. And so from Sally Hemings, reputed slave mother of several of Thomas Jefferson's slave children, to Carrie Butler, to Rosa Parks, who was recently revealed was nearly the victim of sexual assault in a white household. The narrative on sexual violence against women of color has always been spun as either romance or collateral damage. And certainly the blockbuster success of the recent book and movie, The Help, underscores this iconography. The Help, as many of you know, multi-million-dollar blockbuster film, was based on the experiences of a young white woman growing up in 1960s Mississippi, the height of Jim Crow, who helps herself as a cub reporter to the so-called authentic experiences of African American women domestics, egregiously omitting the fact that black women were the movers and shakers within the most profound civil rights movement, human rights movement in American history. And so it's not surprising that The Help was such a blockbuster success, given that this is an era in which leading roles for African American women in film and TV, very powerful regimes of representation, leading roles for black women are as rare as Haley's Comet. And so The Help was extremely successful with white audiences, but elicited controversy and backlash amongst progressive filmgoers of color, who saw a connection between this era of a certain propagandized depiction of black femininity and a dismantling of human rights-oriented public policy, civil rights public policy. Because The Help ultimately relied on the erasure of the role that sexual violence and sexual terrorism play in the articulation of a certain notion of plutocratic so-called American democracy, and substituted instead the technicolor vision of the serviceable black woman, Mammy, asexual, self-sacrificing, God-fearing, of course, and always deeply invested in the trials and tribulations of her white charges. And so this nostalgia for a certain version of black female domesticity and Christian religion piety is, in my mind, part and parcel of what I would dub a new cult of true womanhood. The 19th century cult of true womanhood was an ideology and a social movement that was based on the promotion of very specific ideals of femininity. That is chastity, domesticity, moral piety, sexual purity, the advancement of the notion of the white woman as the protector of home and hearth, as a civilizer of wayward men and children, as fulfilling a very certain, a very specific role within the promotion of American capitalism, emergent U.S. empire. And this was something that really excluded women of color, because women of color were always already constructed as either hypersexual Jezebels, fallen women, or, on the other side of the spectrum, hyper-servile domestics and maids whose sole reason for being was to buttress white women's roles as the civilizers of an emergent imperial nation. And so it's not difficult to connect the dots between these legacies of true womanhood and contemporary anti-abortion propaganda that demonizes and criminalizes the bodies of women of color, demonizes and criminalizes women who are not fulfilling their mission to prop up patriarchy and heterosexism as breeders and as morally impure. And so the moral degradation of women of color is not an abstract concept or matter. These images and this iconography springs ready-made from biblical scripture and from Catholic dogma. And these are the worlds that my students are most intimately connected with. As founder of the Women's Leadership Project, which is a social justice advocacy and feminist mentoring program, which is based in South LA, I train my students to do peer education and outreach on the everyday impact of heterosexism and sexism and misogynistic language and racist misrepresentations of women of color in the media, and the impact of violence both within their schools, communities, and beyond on the everyday lives of young women of color. And a linchpin of this training is enabling them to develop a critical consciousness about the connections between African American and Latina women's struggles around this iconography of the sacrificial good woman of faith. And so students who are doing this kind of work are working in an environment which is, in many regards, the most misogynist and the most sexist in recent memory. And they are very accustomed to being smeared as men-bashing bitches, as man-haters. And this is not just by their male peers, but their female peers as well. And so writing about the revolutionary humanist potential of black women's self-determination, struggle for self-determination, Alice Walker, who is a visionary feminist / womanist and humanist thinker, had this to say in her work, In Search of Our Mother's Gardens. What did it mean for a black woman to be an artist in our grandmother's time, our great-grandmother's day? Did you have a genius of a great-great-grandmother who died under some ignorant and depraved white overseer's lash? Or was her body broken and forced to bear children who were more often than not sold away from her? 8, 10, 15, 20 children, when her one joy was the thought of modeling heroic figures of rebellion. And many of my students do not know who Walker is, nor Carrie Butler, nor Sally Hemings, nor Claudine Colvin, who was a 15-year-old young woman who refused to give up her seat on a segregated bus in 1950s Montgomery, long before Rosa Parks did. Nor did the students know about the real radical, revolutionary human rights work of Rosa Parks before she gave up her seat on that desegregated bus. Nor do they know the foremother organizers, activists, and freedom fighters back in their own family tree who cooked and cleaned and wiped white asses. But when they read Walker's words, they are quiet as death, contemplative, and perhaps newly inflamed. As students of female sacrifice, many of them know the savage politics behind her canvas. And they are intimately aware of the blood price women of color must pay to be free, to even be considered human in this so-called post-feminist society. And as the pro-death, anti-abortion, anti-family values fascists of the right drive their biblical stake through women's bodies, our young black and Latina revolutionaries, the future and the conscience of free thought, will be prepared to face them and to exercise the ghost of strong. Thank you.
The attraction of church and particularly Christian church, to black families, particularly black women?
Well, I think we go back to all the points that I outlined. So, I mean, you look at the Holocaust conditions that, Africans came here under, the dehumanizing iconography that was imposed on them. And, Christian religiosity was a bulwark against that. When they were brought here to this country, there was a promise that if they converted to Christianity, that they would become human beings, persons, invested with rights. Obviously, that didn't happen. And so they forged their own traditions. So there was this, again, osmotic dynamic where you're in a Judeo-Christian context. In order to be considered to be a moral, human person, you have to be indoctrinated into these principles and ideologies. And then that becomes a tool for resisting a dehumanizing regime. And so that's continued on, into the 21st century. But the point of the talk was that if we look at the way in which the dismantling of social welfare has impacted urban communities of color in particular, that the regime of the church has entered into that gap in many respects. Has provided support for families that are disenfranchised and economically struggling. Has provided a kind of connective tissue, within African American and Latino communities. Has provided a sense of, identity and political mobility. So, all of those dynamics are, I think, separate and apart, from the indoctrinating dynamic of Christianity, that we're really looking at the socioeconomic foundations that the church provides to black and brown people.
Oh, yes. My name is Billy Leak. I'm an atheist. And I was checking out YouTube about the Kingdom of Survival. It had Noam Chomsky in it. Mm-hmm. Maybe I'm talking too loud because I got these earplugs. And it was talking about what used to be slavery. It's still in effect, but it's going under hourly wage employees, and I guess you could say salary employees. That's the new slavery. It's hitting everybody now. I mean, I just picked it up, and I'm just checking out you. But what do you have to say about that? Since you had it in your talk.
Mm-hmm. So you mean in terms of the lack of living wage employment? Yeah. Well, I mean, absolutely. That's a linchpin of this. If you look at South LA, for example, very, very few living wage job centers in South LA and in a lot of other communities of color in LA County. So that has become, a kind of, wage slavery, disenfranchisement regime, particularly for people of color who don't have the same levels of education as do Caucasian Americans, but even for those who do have the same levels of education, that you still have deep and abiding discrimination with regard to hiring and employment, and that manifests itself in the wage gap that exists between African Americans and whites and Latinos and whites. As per the data that you saw provided by Brown University, 70% below, white incomes, for Latinos, 60% below white incomes for African Americans.
What about Malcolm X? He said that African Americans were so involved in Christianity because they were trying to be white. He compared it to the straightening of the hair and a number of other things. He thought of it as the white religion, and African Americans were trying so hard to be white. And that's why he got involved with Islam, mistakenly thinking that it was a black religion. What are your feelings about his view of Christianity, of why African Americans, so many, become devout Christians?
I think it is simplistic to say that African Americans are Christians because they want to be white. Again, going to my prior answer, I think that it has to do with the colonial white supremacist context of the United States, and that was the premier founding religion. That is the religion of American national identity. So how were African Americans really going to escape, becoming invested in that particular regime, of identity and social organization? As far as the 21st century context, I think that his comments about African Americans wanting to be white have even less resonance because of the way in which the black church, for example, with all of its problems, and I certainly don't subscribe to the primacy of the black church, but the black church has been a bulwark against the intractable segregation that we see in African American communities. And that was the point of providing the research, on how segregation really has gotten worse in this 21st century context. It's gotten worse because of the lack of living wage jobs. It's gotten worse because, whites do have greater mobility in terms of the communities that they can live in, the schools that they can go to, the jobs that they can get as a result of this nexus between school and community. So I think that Malcolm X's canard against Christianity, has some validity, in terms of the institutionalization of Christianity within early African American communities, but a lot less resonance in the 21st century spirit, in which we see a severe economic disenfranchisement of African Americans with regard to wealth and with regard to education, particularly with regard to the criminal complex and the prison complex, and the way in which so many black youth into adulthood have been sucked into that complex.
Yes, I want to go back to a phrase you used, a social organization. It seems to me that maybe African Americans are not so much religious, but well, they are, of course, but the black church has traditionally been the center of social organization. I drive down Figueroa in Vermont, and I see a church in every corner.
Yeah, absolutely. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and so that's how moral combat begins. The book begins with this evocation of the proliferation of all of these, particularly storefront churches, in the area that I live in, which is near the epicenter of the civil unrest of 1992, the beating of Reginald Denton, lived not far from Normandy and Florence. And so, within that, say, 1 mile radius between, Crenshaw and Florence and Normandy and Florence, there are probably about 20, storefront churches. So why is that? If we go westerly, into, Culver City, Westchester, some of the contiguous areas, you're not going to see that kind of built environment dynamic, with storefront churches. It doesn't exist. So you have to ask yourself why, in terms of these intractable patterns of segregation and white supremacist, cultural ideology. There's a nexus there. And so that's what this talk in the book is trying to bring out and contextualize in terms of secular movement organizing.
On kind of a different subject, you mentioned Troy Davis. I know there was a big effort to get his execution stayed that didn't work, and he was executed, but I was never able to find out what was his case. Why was he executed? What was his crime?
Well, it was claimed that he killed a law enforcement officer in the parking lot. I think it was like a Burger King, sometime in the 80s. But there's actually no forensic evidence, connecting him to this supposed homicide. And so there were several witnesses, to the homicide who recanted their testimony. And, unfortunately, that wasn't taken into account, when this case, came up through numerous appeals. In the back.
Yes, I was struck at one point where you said that the draconian laws in Alabama and Arizona and elsewhere had disenfranchised, among others, undocumented workers. And is it your position that non-citizens resident in the U.S. should be allowed to vote?
No, disenfranchisement is a term that I'm using broadly in terms of, basically dispossessing them of rights. Okay, so for example, undocumented immigrant young people. As we all know, there's been huge debate about whether or not undocumented young people, should be able to apply to college within the state of California, should be able to be in schools, within the state of California. And that's something that is a linchpin issue in Alabama, for example. That there would be scrutiny, of the numbers of undocumented students. That there would be a push out of undocumented students, even though they're claiming that that's not the case, under this public policy. But the effect was that a lot of families, were fearful, that children were going to be targeted, and thus, parents would be targeted for deportation. And the issue is that it's not just undocumented, families that are being targeted and profiled, because families are mixed. There are some people who are undocumented. There are some people who are citizens. So that was the point of highlighting the intersections there, in terms of the human rights piece, not in terms of voting.
You talked about the black church and the most part of the community, and possibly even a nice food for Africa. What is going to be the impact, if any, in the future of secular blacks, atheist blacks, any organization that's happening there in the black community? Could it possibly spur on more integration into the broader community of all of us? I mean, I'm not saying that right. But segregation is, in a sense, is the black church partly existing because there's still segregation. And it is fulfilling a function that the state's not fulfilling in a way.
Right.
If black atheism grows and secularism grows, will that help spur on integration? And will that diminish the need of the black church? Does that make sense?
What I think is a more salient point is that there need to be public policies that affect, economic justice. So that's really the issue, that the black church is existing because it's symptomatic, of the gravity of this alignment of white supremacy and intractable segregation, residential segregation, and then job segregation and discrimination as well. So there need to be, actual national policies, that are going to facilitate African American and Latino mobility, in terms of, greater access to higher education, greater access to living wage jobs. And then, of course, trying to dismantle a lot of the discriminatory policies that exist, within the mortgage lending industry. And that's a huge issue, that blacks and Latinos were targeted for subprime and predatory loans in disproportionate numbers, regardless of their income, credit scores, all of those dynamics, that mortgage lenders and others take into consideration when they're conferring these loans onto prospective home buyers. So I think that it's a constellation of things that need to be addressed. But with regard to an emergent black, non-theist class, if you will, that is compelling vis-a-vis attitudes, that African Americans have about this notion of redemptive suffering, this idea of, tithing to the church, ad nauseum when you're in a state of economic disenfranchisement, working class, low income people, tithing to the church 10% of their middling incomes. This idea again that, one needs to look to some kind of, supernatural figure to move one into, another sphere, of being. Those kinds of, ideological and more sort of cultural concepts, I think, will be impacted by an emergent, black non-theist secular class. And that's something that, if there is no understanding about these institutional factors, then that's not going to happen. Because I think that there's a really simplistic backlash on the part of mainstream white secular humanists, free thinkers, atheists, what have you, and say that race doesn't matter. This is a post-racial context. Everyone has the same opportunity. Why are those ignorant blacks and Latinos still bowing down to this disenfranchising, oppressive religious institution? So there needs to be that kind of critical consciousness within the mainstream context.
Thank you.
I'm wondering whether there is any alternative in your mind to the necessity of injecting big government in order to eradicate racial differences in the light that big government by itself is oppressive and substituted with, let's say, voluntary or letting the people voluntarily adopt policies in their lives that eliminate discriminations are being imposed. Being imposed has turned out to be very, very expensive. Is it terrible in your mind that this cost will continue to be carried by taxpayers?
Absolutely, because if we don't have civil rights laws, if we don't have anti-discrimination laws, then there's not going to be any equity, particularly within the workplace and within the context of education. And, we can look at that with regard to what's happening within LAUSD. As I said, I work very intimately with LAUSD schools. And so, there is abject disparity in terms of, say, let's just take this one example, A through G courses. Some of you, may have high school students know what A through G courses are. Those are college preparation courses. So there are a lot of South LA schools, East LA schools, schools in the so-called inner cities that do not have the full complement of A through G courses taught by highly qualified instructors. But if we go to the west side, if we go to the valley that have predominantly white populations, we're not going to see those kind of disparities. So that's where you need to have some kind of government oversight in order to ensure that young people of color are receiving the same kinds of bedrock necessities, vis-a-vis going on to college, UCs and Cal States, that their white counterparts have. So I think that the argument that privatization can somehow again bootstrap us out of this abyss of institutionalized racial discrimination and gender discrimination and discrimination based on sexual orientation is really a fallacious argument, because there needs to be oversight. And I can go example after example after example, particularly within this context of education in its relation to what are the potentialities for young people later on in life in terms of them moving into living wage jobs, careers, professions that are going to allow them to have sustainability in terms of their own incomes, but also to contribute to the sustainability of their local communities. Yes.
Excellent talk. And thank you for that. And I'm just wondering, what is your position in the LA schools? What do you do?
I'm with the LA County Human Relations Commission. And so the commission does a variety of things, but my focus is primarily youth leadership development, professional development with faculty and administrators, and community organizing with resource providers that work with schools. In addition to writing curriculum, engaging with gender justice organizations around sexual assault and health literacy, HIV/AIDS education, and a whole other range of, I would say, social justice kinds of initiatives.
Could you please say the name again of the woman who, in the 1950s, refused to give up her seat for what?
It was plotted.
No.
It was actually Claudette Coleman. I think I said Claudine. It was Claudette Coleman, 15-year-old.
Claudette Coleman.
At that time, she was 15-year-old.
It wasn't Rosa Parks?
Claudette Coleman was before Rosa Parks. Unsung young woman.
I see. Okay.
Yeah, that's why I wanted to highlight her.
You wanted to sing her. So she wouldn't be unsung.
There you go.
Oh.
Yeah. Great. Okay.
One of your beginning screens was writers, and unfortunately, I think many of us don't know people by face.
Yes.
Could you tell us who those writers were?
So Langston Hughes, James Baldwin, Nell Larson, Langston Hughes, Richard Wright, and Zora Neale Hurston.
I'm sorry, who was the last person?
That's Zora Neale Hurston.
Zornell?
Dora Mill.
Durham.
Their eyes were watching us.
I get the last question, apparently. What should we, as Atheists United, bound by tax law to be not political, nonpartisan, but certainly involved in social issues, what can we do to improve the situation?
Well, actually, there's going to be a discussion on Wednesday about racial politics and quote-unquote diversity in the secular movement. And so one of the things will be, supporting non-theist organizations of color around intersectionality. So intersectionality means, looking beyond, we're thinking about a secular, humanist, free thought, atheist lens, looking beyond that. What are social justice issues that resonate with communities of color, for example? The prison complex is one. Economic disparities are another. Academic issues with regard to the lack of equity for Black and Latino students and other issues. Reproductive justice. All those things are important with regard to how secular humanists of color are thinking about these intersections.
When and where?
It's going to be Wednesday, 7 p.m. That's part of the Cafe Inquiry series.
Cafe Inquiry right here.
Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you.